wherever you are today. Welcome to our OAG webinar. This is the latest in our series of webinars. And today we've got a title of Strap for Cash, How Airlines Can Survive the Winter Season. I'm Becca Rowland, and I'm the host for today's webinar. And I've got with me our guests, Jeremy Robinson, partner with Watson Farley Williams. Thank you, Jeremy, for joining us again. I know you've been with us before and always have lots to say.
Pleasure to be here.
Good. And we've also got John Grant, Senior Analyst at OAG, also always has plenty to say. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, Becca. Week 33.
Oh, week 33, as you say. And Matt Colling, welcome again, Matt, from OAG.
Hi, Becca. Hi, everybody.
So, as usual, the format today will be, we'll run through some slides with bits of information that we've been able to provide, largely from OAG data about the industry and where it's at, and then try to answer some of your questions at the end. So please do use the chat function to send in your questions. And if we can, we'll answer some of those questions as we're going through. Everybody will have access to the presentation afterwards through the OAG website. So before the summer break, we spoke a lot about the need for airlines to make the most of the summer period when they usually see travel peak and they can fill the money box with cash. But as the weeks have come and gone, the combination of traveller uncertainty and travel restrictions have meant that capacity and indeed passenger volumes haven't been what we might have hoped for. That's left airlines with even more depleted of cash and needing to look carefully at their strategies for getting through the next few months. And that's part of what we want to be discussing today. What state subsidies might mean, let me move on the slide, what state subsidies there are and what they're doing, the number of redundancies, prospects for consolidation, and all those other things that airlines need to be considering now if they're going to preserve cash. But first, let's take a look, as we always do, with where we are in terms of capacity and frequency. So this is a slide we've shown many times, many weeks before, where we've color-coded each country in terms of how capacity is, or number of flights, relative to this time last year, this week last year. And the key takeaway we have is that the summer seemed to have peaked about 3 weeks ago at 60 million seats. And now it's at 58.4 million. John, is it all downhill from here?
Yes, Becca. I think the key takeaway is somehow or other we need to find a green pen for you. Because this is just not moving at all. This is a visual we've shown probably from about the third or the fourth week into these webinars, and we still have many countries that are locked down with less than 10% of their normal capacity available, and with little sign of breakthrough. And if you take the Chinese domestic market out of the whole equation, then the situation looks pretty grim. We did get to 60 million in the first full week of August, but as you say, we're now down at 58.4. And if you then look at how that sort of trends through to the end of the year and the historic pattern, there's generally between 9 and 10 million fewer seats in the last week of December than there is in the middle of August. So we're going to get down to about 48 million if we follow that pattern. And that in itself will be probably around 55% below the capacity we had at the beginning of the year. So it's a pretty serious situation we face, and with no great optimism about the next couple of weeks either, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so we're going to move on in a few slides to look at some projections for the end of the year. But in the meantime, this is the picture up to this week, with the week of the 31st of August on the far right-hand side of the screen there. The chart below showing this week versus the same week last year through this year so far, and as we've seen the last few times, it's really plateaued, hasn't it, over the summer?
Well, it has, and if you look at the chart at the bottom of the slide, you can see that Europe has, that line has certainly begun to dip this week. We saw both Ryanair and EasyJet cut somewhere close to 600,000 seats between the two airlines from their networks this week. Now, This time last year, they did cut capacity. They cut it by 25,000 seats between the two airlines. So, you know, that is a significant difference and reduction. And of course, it's all predicated on the back of these ridiculous quarantine requirements that are being applied as a blunt instrument by the UK government and other authorities in Europe. But we're also seeing North America begin to dip back again. Allegiant and Spirit have made capacity reductions. American Airlines have cut 15 destinations from their network. And we've seen lots of announcements about redundancies and furloughs as the CARES Act expires at the end of September. And the whole of the North American domestic market and the airlines are sitting there wondering what's going to happen with 4 weeks' notice and no idea about what the government's intention is going to be. And of course, that's become a political football.
So are you saying that this is the plateauing or possibly reducing of capacity is due to lack of demand, or is it due to increasing restrictions on travel, which mean there's uncertainty for travellers? What's driving the reduction in capacity?
What's driving the capacity is a fear of heavy and sustained losses by the airline industry through the next 8 months and the whole of the IATA winter season. And that's built on a basis of complete uncertainty about their networks that they can operate because of these short-term notices and quarantine requirements, and of course the lack of demand. And you know, it's chicken and egg. The demand will not be there until the consumer can buy with confidence. You know, you're booking for a flight in December or to a destination that may well be closed. Would you put your money into an airline and receive a voucher in 2 months' time? Probably not.
Yeah.
And that's the whole picture around the world, I'm afraid, Becca, and it's creating complexity everywhere.
And this is same sort of data, but for various countries across the Americas and in Europe and Middle East. We see some countries where year over year capacity is up slightly, somewhere it's down slightly, but there's not a lot of movement anywhere, is it? And it's very sad to see the numbers going in the wrong direction in some places.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, if you look at the first chart, the first table there, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, essentially the whole of lower South America is closed, and with the best intentions in the world, there have been ambitions to restart domestic flights in many of those markets in the last week and indeed into next week. And, you know, they are being taken out of the system now, those flights, because they're unlikely to operate and the authorities have not eased restrictions. So, and the tragic part about all of that, Becca, is, you know, those 6 countries are really poorly strapped for cash anyway, and supporting national airlines and air service development is the last thing on their mind. You know, they've got a pandemic that they need to manage.
Yes, I'm sure we're going to come on later to the choices that governments need to make elsewhere, but in these places, the range of choices is limited because they don't have money to support these airlines, do they?
No, and we've seen two of the largest airlines in Latin America enter Chapter 11, and the initial recovery plan for Avianca talks about a fleet of 20 aircraft. And you know, they were a huge airline operating across the whole of lower South America. So the impact for them and their economies and tourism and the rebuild out is dramatic. And you know, in relative terms, Europe looks quite good. Particularly places like Greece, although there's clearly some hesitancy there about COVID infection rates at the moment. But you can directly see where lockdowns have occurred in Europe by seeing the week-to-week change in capacity. It's quite fascinating to see how immediate and how quickly airlines are responding to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to include this next slide, and we'll bring Matt in at this point. So this is a map. It's in a way quite crude because the data behind it is much more granular. But OEG talking to Sherpa, which is a source of data on restrictions at a country pair level. So we're seeing a sort of color-coded sense of what the level of restrictions are. And what we see overall is that if you're traveling between two countries, and presuming you go to one and then you fly back again, actually there's very few country pairs you can fly between with no restrictions in either direction. Matt, can you tell us a bit more about this Sherpa data and what it can provide?
Yeah, with pleasure. As you say, we've been working with Sherpa for a few weeks now, and they've been building a data set throughout the last few months around travel restrictions, and it tends to come in a couple of layers. And the layer you're seeing here is sort of overall countrywide restrictions on international travel. And so, you can see two strategies. There are those countries that have completely closed their borders to international travel, and then there are some which have adopted sort of a partially closed. And what that typically means is you're then seeing those restrictions such as quarantine periods or certain countries where travel, people originating from a particular country are not permitted to travel to another country. There are a few exceptions. The UK is an example here, where in theory the UK's borders are not restricted, but in reality they do have an extensive program of quarantine, trying to perhaps dissuade anything other than essential travel. And so a number of countries you can see, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and lots of South America, excluding Brazil, have completely closed their borders. South Africa and Saudi Arabia the same. And then, countries like the US, Brazil, China and Russia are operating this sort of partially closed model where they're being a bit more specific about where travel is permitted to or from. And the data that we're seeing and what's being announced by countries can get very precise in some situations. The data does step down to regions and states, particularly in the US, in Australia as well. And we've talked in the past about restrictions on travel between hotspots for COVID-19 where cases are increasing, and we've talked about kind of Sydney to Melbourne travel being closed for a period of time, that type of thing. Having played with this data myself for a while now, there are a few interesting nuggets which have come out. So I spotted yesterday that Cambodia, for example, are requesting that international travelers leave a $3,000 deposit at the airport when they arrive to cover any required sort of testing, quarantine, accommodation, that sort of thing. And that's now written into the way these countries are managing their borders. So yeah, it's a relatively new data set for us to be playing with, and we're working to combine this with our own schedules and status information and make this available to our clients, as I say, working with Sherpa. But there's lots to be found, and there are lots of interesting nuances to the data, but it definitely shows the impact that you've been talking about there with regards to how substantially this can affect the desire for airlines to put flights on between different countries.
That's really, I'm sure that level of granular detail about restriction information will be, and travel information will be really useful to people. We are getting a couple of questions about, I think the fact that the UK is green it seems to be problematic, but these are, the colour codes refer to, just to recap, to entry to that country, and the UK is, you're free to enter, but there is a quarantine, isn't there? And so it's not, the color coding here isn't picking up the quarantine, but that is in the granular information, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. So the UK, for example, in theory today has no restrictions on entry. There's no, there are no specific countries where you're not allowed to travel between that country and the UK, but there are lots of quarantine rules in place, as those of us in the UK are very familiar with, and they are changing probably more regularly than people would like. So yeah, this is the first level, if you like, of is the country's border open, partially open or closed. So this is quite a coarse level, but I thought it was interesting to see that there are those countries that are still maintaining a complete carte blanche, no international travel allowed at all, versus those that have moved on to controlled entry, shall we say.
And this is part of what's making it really difficult for travellers, isn't it? We were talking to somebody earlier today who was saying travel from Malaysia to the UK, where you would have, previously you'd have had an option of a non-stop flight, or you might have flown through the Middle East. Now, if you go through the Middle East, you'll be quarantined for 14 days on arrival, whereas the non-stop flight, you won't be. And so travellers are having to really think. There's a lot to take on board, isn't there, when they're thinking about when to travel, how to travel, which route to take, which airline to fly. It's making it a very difficult time for travellers to think about flying.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, the rules are changing regularly. As you can imagine, we have to prepare for the webinars some sort of days in advance. So this is Friday's data, and we've had a comment come in with regards to countries that have changed their rules since Friday. So this is already, this chart is already out of date. The data that we have, I would like to think has caught up with that. Yeah, it is a constantly moving feast, and I think we all know people who have travelled and then been caught out because the rules have changed while they're away. And so when they booked their travel and when they departed, the restrictions meant that they were free to do the travel they were planning, but then whilst they've been away, things have changed and quarantine has become a requirement. And for people who'd planned to come back and return to work, potentially not working from home, that has presented a real challenge.
Okay, well, that's really helpful, Matt, and we look forward to being able to see more of that detailed data in the OEG dataset. So that sets the backdrop for really what we're seeing in the industry. This is a slide we've seen similar before, where we're looking at the seat capacity globally this year, and is the yellow line, the thick yellow line, and last year was the grey line. And each of those thinner yellow lines are a snapshot of the schedule data from earlier on this year, going back to the 20th of April. And what it shows is that, that progression, that steady progression of capacity coming out. John, if we could come back to you now, what we see in the latest iteration is yet more capacity come out, isn't it? And it's actually now for September, it's looking rather lower than it's been. It's actually not just being reduced down a bit. It's quite a lot coming out, isn't it?
Absolutely. This week's 58.4 million was standing at just over 60 million last week. So we're seeing airlines at 7 days' notice taking out, literally hundreds of thousands of seats, and Ryanair and EasyJet being a couple of cases in point, and that's going to continue. But I think what perhaps is the frustration, Becca, is there is no reason for optimism between the 6th of September and the 6th of December in terms of a recovery. It would buck the normal aviation trend of the last 70 years to see capacity grow by that rate, even if it is back to what would be normal times. And we're not in normal times. And the reason for this is many airlines are still holding on to their winter published programs, and many of those are having to do so because there is no clarity yet about the IATA slot situation and the use it or lose it rules, which were waived for the summer program. So essentially, historically, if you did not use 80% of the slots you had, then they were reallocated back to other airlines who wanted them, and that was waived because of the huge uncertainty that was created in the market. That expires at the end of October with the winter programs, and unless the regulators and the authorities waive that requirement again, we will see airlines walk into the winter with an intent to operate because they need to protect the slots they have. Now, we're seeing that at Heathrow, we're seeing that at Gatwick, we're seeing that at other airports around the world. And the inevitable consequence is those airlines who do want to fly, and some have been very public about that, cannot get access to the slots that they want. And equally, other airlines may be forced to fly some very lightly loaded services to protect a slot. And that is just crazy to operate a flight where you make no money. You put more carbon emissions in the sky, you attract all the wrong media attention because the regulator hasn't yet sorted out what should. be a pretty obvious slam dunk decision in the first week of September, waive the slot requirements for the next winter.
Jeremy, can we bring you in at this point? Is the decision for the regulator quite as simple as that they should just waive the slot requirements?
At one level, yes, and I agree with John that without having certainty in the market, you're going to have essentially the environmental obscenity of ghost flights. Now, that's something that I think was baked into the US style bailout of the CARES Act, which required minimum services to be maintained. But in Europe, we avoided that by having the slot suspension. Now, interestingly, a couple of days ago, it was reported that the European Commission, that is, has started a consultation for the next few weeks on whether to extend the slot waiver into the winter season, because as John said, this expires in October, towards the end of October. And the question there will be, will it be exactly on the same terms as before, or will there then be new mechanisms put into this waiver that are designed to preserve some semblance of competition? So in other words, one wouldn't necessarily want airlines with large slot portfolios to use the waiver period, plus the fact that some of them have had generous bailouts, to be able to hoover up slots that are no longer going to be used, and therefore win in the post-COVID environment. So this is an important debate that will continue, but for the meantime, I think it's absolutely imperative that there be certainty on what the slot rules are.
But Jeremy, you know, the real frustration is, as you rightly say, this is now going out for consultation. And anyone who's been involved in the European Union and the consultative process will know that they don't make decisions quickly. And there are airlines that are hemorrhaging cash. There are suppliers to airlines that have furloughed staff and don't know whether to bring them back. You know, the whole situation is absolute madness.
I can't disagree with a word of that. Much though I'd like to try. You're right. I mean, the consultation is for a 4-week period. At the end of that one, we would expect a decision that says this is now going to be preserved for the winter. But during that 4-week period of the consultation, we are still in a position where airlines are having to think, well, we might still have to operate these flights in order to maintain our slots. Yes, that cash continues to race out of the door because, as in any complex legal system, you have to have a process in order to change or amend the law. I don't think that's avoidable. I think there are bigger questions about policy and how government policy is being formed, which has a massive effect on the industry, which Rebecca, I think we will come to later, won't we?
Yes, I think we'll keep discussing this all the way through the webinar today. We just had a question in, Jeremy, which I think is really in your area. Why wouldn't regulators waive the requirement in order to help airlines' economic viability?
I don't think there's a realistic chance of them. When we say waive the requirements, I think we're talking about the 80-20 rule. So as the 80-20 rule was suspended for the summer season, the question is, why wouldn't they carry that on through the winter? In other words, what would an argument be for them not doing so? It's difficult to see what that argument would be, because the inevitable consequence of not waiving it, whilst you maintain the structure of the slot regime as it is, would be airlines operating ghost flights in order to meet their 80% target. So they're spending money on operating flights. They're unable to sell tickets in any significant number to earn any significant revenue. So it's not so much that it would help airlines' economic viability to suspend the requirement, but it would be one way in which government could prevent it getting unnecessarily worse.
Right.
I appreciate that's quite complicated, but I think the options for government actually to do something positive in a legislative sense for the airlines are relatively limited, except for this sort of broader policy question, which is the main constraint on demand, as both Matt and John have talked about, are these restrictions, these travel restrictions and quarantine requirements, which are making demand impossible to forecast or to create. And the real question, I think, is can this policy evolve nimbly so that we can get to a position of not having to have those restrictions? Until we get to a position of not having to have those restrictions, the outlook for aviation must necessarily be very, very bad. The difficulty is that, and I don't necessarily, I'm not sure whether you want to come onto this debate right now, but the difficulty is how far and how quickly not only one government, the UK government, for example, but any government around the world can come to an evolved and nuanced position on policy that balances the need for protection of public health with the broader objectives of allowing people the freedom to decide for themselves what they do.
Let's come on to that a little bit later, because I think what I'd like to do first is we've taken a stab at just how bad it does get, and where does the industry end up by the end of the year. And I know we've done this sort of exercise previously. What we've taken here is that the thick yellow line is where we are today, and then we've projected that forward using the growth in capacity that we've seen over the last 20 weeks, another option for the past 10 weeks, which is a bit faster because it includes that sort of ramping up of capacity we saw at the beginning of the summer. And then for the last 5 weeks, where essentially there's been no capacity growth. And on that particular trajectory, we end the year at 50% of the capacity we had in December last year. Jeremy, John, Matt, where do you think we'll end up? Is the consensus that we're flat to the end of the year? That lowest one is probably where we end up. In which case, all of us, when we were talking earlier in the summer, we thought we were being realistic as opposed to negative, but actually, turns out we were quite positive.
Yeah, I personally think it could be slightly lower, Becca. I mean, both your 20-week and your 10-week growth lines are enjoying the benefit of the noticeable spike that occurred around the 13th of June and the 20th of June, when a lot of capacity was put back into Europe. And once you strip that back out, and particularly if you do look at the last 5 weeks trend, then it looks as though it's going to go down. And I think if you looked at last year's data and you looked at the last 5 weeks and then how capacity adjusted to the year end, that went down as well. And I go back to, we could, if we follow the same patterns we've seen previously, be between 8 and 9 million seats fewer by the end of December than we were in the first 2 weeks of August. And that places us down in the 52, 53 million type sort of market, and that wouldn't surprise me. And I think I'm seeing more and more people agree with that consensus. There is no reason for optimism between now and Christmas, apart from the 24th of December when Santa Claus gets in his sleigh.
Well, we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, some of which we're taking as we go. But if you're listening in and you want to comment on where you think we'll end up at the end of the year, then by all means put your comments into the chat area, and let us know if you agree with John that it might be more negative than we're seeing there. So what we've seen a lot of capacity come out for September. Back in 20th of July, September was looking globally as if we'd have about 83 million seats in the market, and now the picture as of this week is for half that. And you can see from this that it's come out week by week by week. Matt, I wanted to come to you now, that for OAG as a data manager, that must be quite a headache to manage a schedule that's changing that much over such a short space of time, and is so volatile.
Yeah, absolutely, it is, and the volume of schedules changes that we as an organisation are having to process has escalated to levels we've never seen before. The challenge, as we've said before, is often that the data is coming in small slices, that it comes in every week, rather than in sort of these lump sums that we might have seen as airlines were submitting their seasonal schedules, etc. But we're also seeing the data arriving with a much shorter time frame prior to the date of operation. So as you can see here, these sort of 6 grey slices are being taken out of the capacity, and that obviously causes a big challenge for us managing the data, and something I'm pleased to say that we've managed to keep up with, and we're in contact with a huge number of airlines on a kind of feels like a daily basis, but perhaps a weekly basis. Data is flowing in, of course, daily. So yeah, it has been a challenge, but it's noticeable, of course, that this challenge is perhaps felt most keenly from those members of our customer base who are looking to kind of plan and predict what's going to be happening, whether that's predicting demand of service or supply, or plan operations. So yeah, it's been a huge challenge, and one that doesn't seem to be kind of seeing a kind of an end date. The airlines are still behaving in this way, as this data shows.
Yeah, but it's good to have a source of data that tells us what's happening in the industry like this. So let's have a look at where that capacity's come out from by airlines, and this shows the airlines that have taken out the most capacity from their schedules over the last 4 weeks, with EasyJet at the top of that list. So John, what's driving these airlines at the top? Why are they now taking out, in EasyJet's case, 4.5–5 million seats?
Because Boris has spoken. And
so this is restrictions again. This is down to the restrictions, is it, or is it because actually they need to just reduce what they're operating and preserve cash?
It's a combination of all things, Becca. I mean, this is a lot of capacity, and it's not all being taken out for the next week. This is adjustments through to the end of the summer program and going into the winter. But it is a feeling about market sentiment and confidence in the European marketplace that EasyJet are reflecting. For LATAM, this is a complete result of their Chapter 11 process and their need to come out with a restructuring plan, which inevitably means fewer aircraft and a smaller network. In the case of Indigo, then they were hoping for more approval for services from the Indian government in the domestic market, and that's not been forthcoming in the last couple of weeks. And in the case of Wizz Air, they were one of the bullish carriers, and perhaps they've been caught a little bit, and the market hasn't recovered as strongly as they wanted. So all of these airlines have different reasons for making the capacity cuts, but they all ultimately stem back to the same core problem, which is market confidence and clarity about future operations. So all of these are struggling with the same challenges, and at some point you have to cut your capacity and go and make those cuts now.
Yeah. So we're going to have a look now. We showed this slide last time, which is the data from Ishka, their matrix, and so this hasn't changed. We haven't updated this particular slide, and we've had discussions amongst ourselves as to which box a different airline sits in. But I guess what we wanted to do was use this as a basis to then go on and talk for the rest of the webinar really about what is it that airlines need to do to survive the winter. And we obviously have quite a number of airlines in that top row that are at high risk financially. I know we've had a question in from Eleanor. What do you think the longer term impact will be? Will there be some airlines that will go bankrupt and disappear entirely? Will some smaller routes never be put back into service? Will society change its behaviour in a lasting way? Is that what we're seeing here? Are we going to see some of these airlines disappear, do you think?
Probably not many from this list here. These will probably all in some shape or form see their way through it, but some of the smaller ones will probably that don't make this list would probably struggle and may not survive. Becca, we are in a fascinating situation if it wasn't so serious, because when we entered COVID-19, many airlines, travel agents and tour operators encouraged travellers to essentially carry forward their booking for 12 months. So, you know, if you had a £10,000 holiday to Florida that you would have taken this summer, just book it, roll it forward 52 weeks, and we'll see you next year. And that means that quite a few airlines are sitting on some load factors and some schedules and some demand for May, June, and July of next year that, in comparative terms to previous years, looks pretty strong. And the cash is in the bank, or the voucher is in the bank. So for some airlines, getting through to May of next year and being able to do that by either cutting costs, scaling down their network, taking further loans, getting government support or bonds, whatever it happens to be, could actually see them in quite a good space, because they're going to enter next summer, when hopefully we have a vaccine, with probably a more confident traveller, and yet much of the capacity will already have been taken out. The A380s won't be around, the 747s will have a better fit of capacity to demand. And those people who would be booking a transatlantic holiday in April for July or August might find the fare is 30 or 40% higher than it normally is. So if they can get through this period, the prognosis for next summer and beyond is, you know, quite optimistic. You can see a fairly quick recovery in cash in some of the carriers, and some profitability. But getting through the next 7 or 8 months is really going to be the challenge, and that's why, you know, it is all about strapped for cash right now.
And it's going to be hard to see as well. I know we've had some discussions amongst ourselves about what will happen with yields and revenue management. You know, will passengers pay more to have flexibility so that on their return they know they can change their flight if they have to, if the quarantine rules change and travel restrictions change? Or are the airlines going to waive, you know, some of the normal premium privileges and allow anybody to have that flexibility to persuade them to fly with them? So it's quite we're hearing anecdotally stories that are in different ways, aren't we, about what's happening to yields, whether people are paying a lot more or whether that might not be the case.
Yeah, and you know, we the calculation from some of the US majors is by waiving their charges, which many of them seem to have agreed to do over the weekend. That's potentially a $2.8 billion loss of revenue to them.
So they make 2.8 billion normally from charges on
from changes to tickets. Now, you know, the other side of that is, well, if that encourages the market to come back with maybe 10% more confidence than it otherwise would do, is that a better bet and a better opportunity than continue to impose those changes for bookings? And the answer is yes, it probably is. But we then end up, of course, with a very blurred picture between the traditional booking curve of a leisure passenger and the booking curve of a business class passenger, and a real challenge as we go forward about how do you price for each segment and how do you do it competitively, which may play back to, you know, the point-to-point low-cost airlines being in an advantageous position. It's a fascinating situation, and of course, one of the things we've not factored in and we forget is, for many airlines in the United States, particularly the big three carriers and Qantas, the value that their credit card programs and the continued revenue generation that their credit card programs create, because it's not just about using those credit cards for airfares and travel. You know, they are for many families and people the go-to credit card for their groceries and white good purchases. So the airlines are still earning money from those flows as well.
Right. Let's have a quick look at the US. We've already talked about the seats that have come out recently out of the schedules, and the chart on the left-hand side here shows just how many seats some of the US carriers have taken out, with the exception of Delta and Spirit, which have kept their capacity broadly similar. But you did this analysis on the right, John, last week, showing just that impact of the CARES Act on smaller airports and how it's distorted the market, haven't you?
Well, I'm not sure if the word is distorted, but how it has created advantage for those smaller airports. And when it was launched, of course, one of the prime motives of the CARES Act was to protect regional connectivity and make sure all of those secondary airports were served. And if you look by airport size in the United States, you can see that the least impacted airports in terms of size are those between 100,000 and 1 million seats per annum, where they have, and it's not being flippant, only lost 32% of their capacity, whereas in the 5 to 10 million and 10 million plus, it's nearer 40%. But of course, this comes back to the whole point of, and to some of the things for Jeremy to perhaps enlighten us on is be careful what you wish for, because you've now created a situation where, for perfectly good reasons, the US airlines are now holding these airports, these cities, these mayors as hostages to fortune, because they're already saying without an extension of the CARES Act, we're going to be cutting 15 services in the case of American, and we identified Delta and United probably have between another 30 and 50 cities that they could leave in the next 2 months without the necessary support. And once those routes are dropped, trust me, from all of my route development work I have done, it is extremely difficult to get those services back, because airlines will see them as marginal, they're non-core, they're not profit making, they don't add value to the system network, etc., etc. And there's a potential threat that a lot of US airports in that 100,000 to 1 million category are at risk of seeing their air service decimated over the winter program.
So that's the airports. What are we've got a good question here from Susan Levitt. We've had a lot of discussion about the airlines getting through and sort of sitting and waiting to see what the regulators do and the governments do and where there's financial support. But what is it that they can do for themselves in this time? What is it, either John or Jeremy, what should airlines be doing at this point in time to try and change their own fortunes, rather than sitting back and waiting for the US government to change the CARES Act? You extend the CARES Act or the equivalent in Europe. What should we be looking for them to do?
Well, quite frankly, it's all about confidence, isn't it? It's about confidence to travel, confidence in the marketplace, confidence in the whole process and the ecosystem. And in my weekly blog on this particular subject, I suggested that maybe we've reached a point where maybe it wouldn't be ridiculous for airlines to give free tickets to people to rebuild confidence. We know word of mouth is one of the greatest ways to rebuild, trust, and to demonstrate that something does work and it can be extremely safe. We know all the processes are in place. You can get COVID tests done in the United Kingdom and responses in 24 hours. Why do we need to have all these quarantines, etc.? In China, they have a scanning system where they actually track what your COVID situation is and whether you can travel or not. So I think it's all about trying to get a more proactive stance, but that is not going to come from the airlines whilst the regulators continue to suppress and frustrate and create the confusion. It's not fair to expect the airlines and the airports to take that risk in this current environment where things are being changed so arbitrarily and so quickly.
Shall I come in?
You wanted to come in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, John is absolutely right. The game is confidence in traveling, in the market, in the process, and word of mouth. And yes, airlines are dependent somewhat on regulators. The question is, what can airlines do to change the terms of the debate? Because if we change the terms of the debate in relation to public health and regulation of infectious disease, then you can press the reset button and say, okay, now we can travel again as normal. John, you said, hopefully by next year there'll be a vaccine, and this miracle will sort of green light a lifting of all restrictions and life can go back to normal. But the question is, what if there isn't? What if there isn't? Can we nonetheless, and in the interim, move towards a position where the level of restrictions is somehow reduced, even if there is no sort of universally accepted vaccine to get rid of the problem? And that's just a complex question. I mean, the airlines have done well to make sure that their processes are as safe as they can be, and that airports have likewise played their part in making sure that the travel process is as safe as possible. But what needs to happen, I think, is as we get to know more about coronavirus, bear in mind this has only been going for about 8-9 months now, so we still don't know a huge amount about it. We need to know more about who is vulnerable. We need to know more, and this debate is growing in volume, about the relationship between infection and serious illness and even death. And as that level of knowledge increases, so the airlines should be right on top of this, saying this is not about support for the airline industry. It is about having better knowledge on which to make much more careful judgments about whether restrictions are needed, and if so, what those restrictions are and how they can be reduced to the minimum. Because ultimately, we need to get back to a position where people can take their own informed decisions in relation to their own risk of serious illness to travel. At the end of the day, the best way to visit friends and relatives who are abroad is to go and see them rather than on a video. The best way to do business overseas is to hop on a plane and do that deal. And we've done an awful lot. We've learned an awful lot during the lockdown period, but nothing replaces actually face-to-face contact. I think airlines should be more proactive about wading into the public debate, because otherwise, ultimately, it's the politicians who will make policy, and the question is, what evidence are they listening to in order to make that policy? At the moment, the evidence has suggested we need to have an absolute clampdown on importing infections from overseas. And the question will come, and I suspect within a matter of weeks, is this the only approach we can be using?
I think that's really interesting. And if we move on to the next slide, I don't want to sort of take the subject in a different direction entirely, but this slide looks at the state of state support, and what we've seen so far back in April, May, a lot of governments stepping in and supporting, but it was sort of on the basis that they were getting through the summer, they were helping the airlines out until around about now, or September, October, and as the table on the left shows, when we compare that level of support that's given, admittedly it's in different forms, it's not all sort of straight cash, as it were. If we compare it to the seats that have been operated by each of those airlines or the airline groups so far this year, January to August, some of those numbers are huge on a per seat basis. So that sort of support, that can't really carry on as it is, can it? We can't keep expecting governments to fund airlines in that way, it seems, and therefore, or can we? And therefore, what you're saying, Jeremy, about a more nuanced conversation about what is it we're trying to achieve needs to take place.
Well, this is a really, really interesting point, because I think, as I argued much earlier in the crisis, maybe on earlier webinars, your position as a government on whether or not you decide to support carriers and airports or not really depended on what kind of bet you were making on the future. And in those early days, when we imagined that somehow by mid to late summer we'd be over this and things would slowly get back to normal, albeit the new normal will be smaller than the old normal. In those days, we thought, well, okay, those who are putting bailouts in place in different forms are saying, okay, we think this carrier does have a chance of survival. We think this industry needs to be in place. We need to keep these jobs in place. Whatever the sort of diverse motivations, there was this sense of we've got to keep this going. And then there were those who decided, actually, we don't want to be putting in place bailout schemes. That might be because, well, we're not sure about the moral hazard example. We're not sure of our ability to gain suitable concessions from the industry. Or frankly, we don't know when the end of this crisis is going to be. And the result of that, and the result of different states' approaches, has been arguably quite a substantial distortion of competition that would exist in normal circumstances. And then the question is, do you carry that on now that we know that there is no end apparently in sight to the crisis for aviation? Do you keep on tapping the capital markets? Do you keep on extending national debts to cover this, or do you take a break and say, actually, we need to find a way out of the crisis first before we decide to put more money into a particular sector? I think governments have an awful lot on their plate with unwinding of furlough schemes, and as you mentioned earlier in this call, with the potential expiration of the airline provisions of the CARES Act unless renewed. So the idea of just saying, okay, there's this limitless money tree that we have somehow found in order to power our way through COVID, and that we're going to carry on bailing out airlines when we actually have no policy solution to where the end of this crisis is, seems to me to be economic madness. So I think the question, it goes back to my previous comments about, well, what is the way out of the crisis? Failing which, I think it's up to the airlines to take their own best decisions as best they can to preserve their cash.
But Jeremy, is there not, these are big numbers, and this is stuff that is strategically important for many national economies. If these subsidies, these support programs were put in place in April and May, with an assumption that they would see the airlines through to the end of September, October, and everything would begin to look better in September and October, and it palpably does not. It's a very easy argument to say, well, it hasn't got any better, so therefore I need more money. And you gave it to me in the summer, so can I have it now?
And you're right.
It's a blank check sort of situation. And, Becca, if you move on to one of the next slides, I think there is a damning assessment of one particular airline and how many employees they have per 10 million ASKs. Some airlines have hidden behind various subsidies, supports, and programs to avoid making necessary organizational cuts that perhaps would put them in a fit for future business place. And that's just, if you think about it, what this has done in terms of fair competition or unfair competition, how can Lufthansa and the Air France KLM group have received so much money, and the UK's two major airlines, who are competing on many of the same market flows, received minimal support? It's a situation that is just unequal, and maybe, just maybe, those subsidies have been created for the wrong reasons and not at the sort of holistic global level, rather than each country looking after its own self-interest.
Well, yes and no. I mean, when you're looking at European airlines, there is a country element to it, namely that each country decides whether or not, as a matter of policy, it wishes to apply for permission to grant state aid within the European rules. But the European rules are at a European level, and the European rules are there to control egregious use by member states of the EU of their state resources to prop up the businesses of their choice. So it's a combination of national and EU factors. The fact remains, there is no perfect system of state aid control in place now, and unfortunately the system does enable some fairly odd results to come out. That's a product of the system. You're not going to be able to change that system to one that works more equitably in the shall we say, in the foreseeable lifespan of this crisis. It is something that I think ought to be considered for the future. But if the law permits an airline group to have a conversation with its government to say, look, a lot of you government ministers are going to lose your seats in Parliament and your jobs with the coming mass job losses if you don't bail us out. That's pretty persuasive for a politician, I would imagine. And different countries have sort of placed different national strategic importance on having an airline and on the value of employment as a good in and of itself, as opposed to is this a rationally operating business designed to make profit and operate efficiently? And those differences are often age old, and I don't think you're going to be able to regulate those differences out of existence. The fact remains, the UK position, which obviously affects British Airways, EasyJet, for example, has been, well, no bailouts, exhaust private resources first. That was a very early statement by the UK Chancellor. And I don't see that policy changing at all. I certainly, one could imagine various airlines, other airlines going to their government saying, right, well, we need to have an extension of this. But then the question from government back to the airlines should be, okay, well, you want more money, we want more conditions. And one of the criticisms of the CARES Act that I've noted has been, well, the stock purchase aspects of the US carriers weren't ambitious enough. That in addition, the CARES Act did not place environmental obligations on the US carriers, unlike some of the European bailouts. So with more money, you can impose more conditionality. I think that's a really interesting argument to follow as we move through the winter season.
I'm going to draw you to a close on that point, Jeremy, now, because we've still got a couple of slides to go, and we're getting close to the end of the hour. And I know we've answered some of the questions that have come in as we've gone, but there's quite a few we haven't got to. So it'd be nice if we could get to one or two. I'm just going to show this slide very quickly. One of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about that Ishka matrix and the airlines at risk is just, how this industry is unlike many other industries in that we have certain foreign ownership rules. In places like South Africa and the US, it's only up to 25%. So when we're thinking about airlines at risk, and I think we've talked in previous webinars a bit about consolidation and would we expect to see consolidation. It's not quite as simple and straightforward as it might be in other industries. But you were saying, Jeremy, earlier today when we spoke that you thought that was a distraction, really.
I think it is. I mean, in normal times, consolidation can happen up to certain limits. You've set them out here. I think in this scenario, the other thing is, well, who wants to buy these airlines? Now, some of these airlines might be fantastically good value, but unless you have potential suitors, then I don't think the foreign ownership rules are particularly important in this context, nor are they going to change within any timescale that somehow loosens this all up. So no, I think the foreign ownership rules are kind of annoying holdover. They are antiquated, but I don't think that's the main story here.
And I think, John, you were saying earlier today that actually, we've talked before about in every crisis there's opportunities, that actually we are seeing airlines coming forward. People wanted to start airlines actually in the current environment, seeing an opportunity to just start from scratch.
Absolutely. Seven new airlines have approached OAG to receive their IATA two-letter prefix in the last couple of months, and none of them are big, but some entrepreneurial type individual who's well connected, access to capital, certainly access to aircraft at very competitive lease rates, skilled management teams, operational staff, airport slots available, etc., etc. If someone could time it right, and that probably is about May 2021, for a 7 or an 8 aircraft size single new generation operation could certainly disrupt the market and be quite successful very quickly.
I love the idea of disrupting
adversity is
the market in the current
opportunity.
circumstances.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what disrupting it is now. If it couldn't be much more disrupted than it is. We've got one more slide here, just quickly. This just looks ahead at the winter schedule, so winter 2020, and compares it to what happened with the winter 2019 schedule in terms of capacity. And you know, the yellow line is this winter, the 22 weeks that make up the winter season. And I guess I looked at this and just thought, this is, given everything we've said until now, this is fantasy, isn't it?
Yeah, it just reflects where we are, Becca, I'm afraid, and you know, we're all holding on and we're all hoping, and whether it materialises, I think, is extremely unlikely. It's part of that whole slot issue we were discussing earlier. We're not going to see 12 flights a day from Heathrow to New York between American Airlines and British Airways on their joint venture this winter, I suspect.
No. So I know we're just about out of time. I felt we should fit in one more question, and the question I'm picking is one about vaccines, because we always get lots of questions that say, what happens when there's a successful vaccine? What difference does it make? So do you want to, each of you, perhaps give me just your very short take on what difference does a vaccine make, albeit that Jeremy's already said we shouldn't plan on that basis necessarily, but Jeremy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, confidence, Becca.
Confidence, it would bring confidence to the market. Yeah. Jeremy?
Yeah. I'd like to be as succinct as John, but I don't think I can. So allow me 2 sentences. I think the problem with vaccines that I'm hearing is that one shot may not be enough, at least for some of the ones that are currently being tested. So if you end up in a situation where everyone has to carry a vaccine passport around with them in order to travel, and you have to stay up to date, and that's an annual thing, a bit like the flu jab, I think that massively complicates the picture.
Thank you. And Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I guess for me, my question would be how quickly that vaccine would be available to different countries and their access to it. So I don't think it would be an overnight change. I think John's absolutely right. It'll have a huge impact on confidence, but for some countries, they may not be able to access that as quickly as others, and so they may still find themselves subject to restrictions from other countries. And so I think it will take time for a vaccine to become something that's available to everybody, and therefore the travel restrictions will stay for some time. Okay, well, that's quite a sobering conclusion, really. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Jeremy and John and Matt, for your contributions today. As always, really, really great to hear from you. If you want to find out more about OAG's views and some of the data that we're getting each week, do look at the recovery tracker on oag.com. We'll be back in a month with another webinar on the first Wednesday of October, so please do join us then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.